Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams, our co-host. And Daniel, it's good to see you.
How are you this morning, Dr. Paul?
I'm doing quite well, thank you.
Excellent.
And we have to digest a few things here on a matter. Can you believe that the president is a good friend of the Russians and about to undermine our country?
No.
Well, anyway, there's a story out in the New York Times this weekend essentially saying, you know, there was an investigation to find out if he was really a Russian spy. Yeah. and to the point where people were taking it seriously, they have to defend that. I think that's the kind of thing ought to be laughed off. You know, It's such a joke. But people have had to answer it, and we came across one friend of ours that did a very good answer. Several have done it, but David Stockman put it on his own website. But he's been quoted about this, and he analyzes this quite well, and the silliness of it and all the misinformation. But that the story goes that when Trump got into office, he fired Comey.
Yeah.
Most everybody remembers that. And of course, we would realize that the Democrats and a lot of Republicans in the war state, the war party, they'd all be furious, and they were. And so this thing passed, but now, the way I understand it, the New York Times comes up with, do you know what happened after that? The FBI was so threatened, even though the FBI works for the president. You know, the president's supposed to be in charge of that. Yeah. But the FBI, that holy group, you know, that enforces law and believe in law and order and justice, they said, you know what, this could be really, really serious, so we have to, start an investigation. I want to read that part that actually David quoted in his article, and it comes from the New York Times. It sort of set the stage for how they were thinking. Of course, from our view, at least, it looks like it's all a fraud and fake and, a scam and all part of this hate Trump, no matter what. They're not dealing with the issues we'd like to deal with. We want to deal with, foreign policy and Syria and different things like that. But this is the kind of scandalous things. And maybe New York Times has succumbed to thinking that they have to be a scandalous newspaper to sell any. And evidently they're not doing that well anyway, even with the scandalous stuff. But let me go ahead and quote this from the New York Times. In the days after President Trump fired James B. Comey as FBI director, law enforcement officials became so concerned by the president's behavior that they began investigating whether he had been working on behalf of Russia against American interests, according to former law enforcement officials and others familiar with the investigation. The inquiry carried explosive implications. Counterintelligence investigators had to consider whether the president's own actions constituted a possible threat to national security. Sounds pretty serious. Agents also sought to determine whether Mr. Trump was knowingly working for Russia or had unwittingly fallen under Moscow's influence. The only thing I can think of, Tanya, they finally got a little bit annoyed that maybe Trump was winning this argument, America first arguments, to make America great again. But anyway, this is outrageous, and I think articles now are frequent in the last couple of days to show the absurdity of all. But nevertheless, this is top issue, and one that has to be refuted, but it has to be ridiculed too.
Yeah, and these are two outrages that we're dealing with at the same time. The first is the New York Times piece, which presents this as if there was plenty of evidence, and the only two possible choices is whether Trump was knowingly or unwittingly working for the Russians. There was nothing in the piece except a little tiny thing buried at the bottom saying, well, there was never any evidence and nothing ever came out of the investigation anyway. That's the only thing you see buried in the bottom. So the explosive article about this got everyone talking. Oh my gosh, the FBI thought their own president was a Russian spy. And that, the original, but this happens all the time, the original explosion of expectations, and then when you start picking at it, it's just a lot of hot air and it just sinks and fluffs,
right.
So that's what it was all about.
They've essentially implied that he was a Russian spy, that he was committing treason. I believe it reaches that point. But I keep thinking, well, maybe we're a little bit too lenient. Maybe there should be something that would allow, charging somebody with slander.
Yeah.
But of course, that's not a practical thing. But in a way, this is very slanderous and it's wrong. And in politics, that would be the least place where they would have any concern about First Amendment. But anyway, I think they're slanderous. I think the paper accused them of treason. I think they're totally irresponsible. And hopefully the American people wake up and say, enough is enough. Let's go back and talk about the wall or something.
Yeah.
Instead of trying to paint Trump as a close ally and a pro-Soviet and opposed to American interests. That's pretty bad.
But when you dig into the justification for launching this investigation, that's when all the red sirens go off, because this was launched by Andrew McCabe, who was the acting director after Comey was fired, who himself has since been fired for illegally leaking information and lying about it. Him, Peter Strzok, and Lisa Page, the two people that were having an affair and having thousands of text messages about how they have to bring down Trump. These three people launched it without telling the Justice Department, which they're required to do. Here's what Strzok messaged to Page, the person he was having an adulterous affair with. He said, quote, "We need to open the case we've been waiting on now," while Andy is acting. Andy, of course, being Andrew McCabe, an Obamaite who was holding the reins of power.
I better go back and read that New York Times article. I don't think it was in that article. Explain that. That
Fine
wasn't
print. Fine print.
That wasn't there. So, no, excuse me. No, it's to me pretty outrageous. But we shouldn't be shocked. I mean, it's so bad. It's been going on. It's probably even longer than this campaign and this president. There's some degree of this all the time. But what's disappointing is how gullible the people are. The factions are just lined up. No matter what is said by the New York Times and by the war party people, they're going to accept it and then hate Trump even more. And of course, Trump people will dig in their heels.
And we're frustrated because we're trying to criticize the dumb things that Trump is doing, and where the Democrats should be, presenting an opposition, they're so, enraptured with this idea that he's a secret Russian spy. But here's the justification that the FBI, when you dig down, these are the several things that they used to justify suspicions that the president was a Russian spy. One, in July of 2016, he joked that the Russians should look into Hillary's 30,000 missing emails. This was a joke. It was clearly a joke. Everyone understood at the time it was a joke. He meant it to underscore the fact that she's over there with her private server, bleach bidding it and all this stuff. He said, maybe the Russians have it. They should take a look at it. Second thing, he refused to criticize Putin on the campaign trail, as if there's an obligation to criticize a foreign leader on the trail. This is real. This is true. The second thing, the claim is that the Republican Party softened its position on Ukraine in a way that seemed to benefit Russia. So there's a secret, there's Putin influencing Trump, whereas in fact, what happened is the Republican Party rejected an amendment that would have toughened it, because this was Obama's mess. The whole Ukraine thing was Obama's mess. And so that understands. And then the final thing, they used the Steele memo, the Steele dossier, which is discredited since then. Everything in it's been discredited as far as we know. And it was paid opposition research from Hillary Clinton. Can you imagine using that as a basis to launch an investigation? So it's totally absurd.
The fact that Trump never said any bad things about Saudi Arabia or any criticism, does that mean he's a Saudi supporter? Well, it turns out that he's probably closer to that, because he's going along with their foreign policy, and unfortunately, sometimes at the wrong time with Yemen and other places. But that's how silly the whole thing gets. But this all is a consequence of and the setup is permitted because we are so much involved. But this is a stretch. And I think the hatred and the bitterness between the two parties is something is worse than usual, and it's a consequence of a status quo that isn't very healthy, and they can't move. I mean, whether it comes to finances or backing off. I mean, Trump has some good instincts. He says we need to back off, and we shouldn't be in Syria. And then the war party gets hysterical. And so the war party joins in this kind of trash, from the New York Times. at the same time, they join in when Trump wants to do something right and say, hey, look, we don't need to be there. So it is pretty hard to shift gears, and the powers to be are pretty darn powerful, because I think most people realize that the president is not nearly as powerful as the deep state.
Yeah.
The deep state's been able to accomplish things way beyond law and order, and sometimes they even get involved in foreign coups and coups maybe even in the United States, being involved. So they are very, very powerful. And this whole thing that this was orchestrated by the FBI, and the president's in charge of the FBI, and they're going to turn around and investigate him to find out if he's a loyal American.
Can you imagine if when you were on the Hill, if your staff started an investigation on you?
No, I can't imagine it.
But it's amazing, that I think one of the things that it shows is I think it was David that wrote this, the groupthink in Washington. This really exposes it. If you have a president that challenges the foreign policy status quo, that challenges the conventional wisdom on foreign policy, that we have to have enemies overseas to justify having the massive military budget we have, to justify 1,000 bases overseas. If you challenge that at all, then somehow you're going to incur the wrath of the entire world upon your shoulders. And I really don't think Trump understood how vicious and dangerous the deep state is. I think he was a little naive when he walked in there with a clear mandate from the people to do some of the things. And the other thing is, if he's a spy, he openly ran on a policy of getting along with the Russians. It was not a secret. Usually spies do things in secret. Every time I saw him in front of the microphone, what's so bad about getting along with Russia? Why shouldn't we get along with Russia? If he's a spy, he's probably the lamest spy ever.
Yeah. When this is done, the people who, are critical of Trump on this issue are always the champions of American values and American democracy. And, of course, they put it in context of their moral authority and moral obligation to bring the truth to the world. And so they believe this stuff. Now, some, I guess, know darn well what they're doing, but a lot of the followers will say, that's right, we need this, and we need a more open border, one world government, but if it's going to be that, we have to establish moral order, and since we are the power of the world, it is our obligation to do that, which is so outlandish when you think about the transition from what our nation was once at one time, to where we are today, where we don't have a lot of moral authority, and our military power is sort of even with all the weaponry, sometimes it's sort of like a paper tiger too, because we don't win any wars, and we don't follow our Constitution. Yet we do this in the name of spreading liberty and the Constitution. We were talking about Venezuela. One of the reasons was we wanted to install a constitutional government in Venezuela. That's all this same theory here. If they would just be good constitutionalists like us, and the people promoting this, what kind of polite term can we use? There is no polite term to describe what they're like. It's really just a power-hungry group of people that have a lot to gain from it. Not only do they gain because gold and power is an aphrodisiac for them, but the money's involved too, because it's oil and military spending and many other things.
Absolutely. And the one thing we also looked at, Moon of Alabama had a pretty good synopsis of what happened too. And they made an interesting point, and this is why we have Obama in the title too, other than the fact that these were Obama loyalists in the FBI that launched it. But Obama made some interesting executive order changes just as he was leaving office that made it easier for the FBI to launch counterintelligence investigations such as this, and to gain signals intelligence, electronic intelligence from the NSA, which may have helped them to investigate the Trump campaign more thoroughly, things that are now coming out in the Mueller investigation. So definitely Obama had a sniff of what was going on, wrote this executive order that made it quite a bit easier to do.
Yeah, and a lot of people, sort of forget about that. It's easy if you are a partisan to say, well, we hadn't elected Trump. I can think of a lot of things that could have been different, but I think that's the unforgiveness, and they had to have that final plan. What will we do if some weird thing happens, like Trump getting, elected? We had to have this plan. So I think that was the most astounding thing. I mean, even Hillary doesn't know it's happened. She doesn't know she's lost yet. she's still working on it. There must have been a mistake. So it's something that it's important because it's political nonsense and goofy stuff, but it's in the midst of foreign policy problems that could explode any time around the world. It's in the situation where we have financial problems that could have really an explosion of some type of financial crisis. So then with this bickering going on, we know that one thing, this whole thing about the government closed down is pretty much of a fake, about who's suffering, I've been impressed with the fact, even the left, even the New York Times and everybody else, that they only sympathize, not only, but most of the sympathy is 800,000 people, they're out of work and they didn't get their check and they're sympathizing. But I think there's evidence that the people who don't have their services aren't yelling and screaming. There's some incidents, and I'm sure there will be, but the real problem is the concern about the government officials that might be a week late for their check.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I would just say in closing, the Democrats won the House promising to, for better or for worse, revisit the issue of health care and all of these things that they were promising. Now what we're hearing is they're going to launch an investigation on right-wing extremism. They're going to continue with more Russia investigations. It really remains to be seen whether the people that voted for the Democrats want more of this stuff, want more of this confrontational, really fact-free, really substance-free sort of things. It remains to be seen. I tell you what, Dr. Paul, one thing that I'm interested in is the emergence of Tulsi Gabbard as a candidate on the Democratic Party, because I think she stirs things up. She has got them in an absolute frenzy. They're terrified because she's also breaking some of the sacred shibboleths of Washington, D.C. So I think that will be something for us to watch in the future.
Yeah, I think that is important, and I think Gabbard, along with Beto takes a foreign policy similar to hers. So that's going to put a division within the Democrats, because it points out how hypocritical they are. The progressives are supposed to be the anti-war people, and here you have 2 out of 30 candidates for the Democratic presidency that actually is taking a position with why are we doing this? So that'll be interesting. It's a long way to go to the next election. Who knows what will happen? But it's something that we will, of course, be watching very closely. But it's the important thing is that we know who and what they're doing and why they're doing it. And quite frankly, it's not good when you know the details of this. It's just too bad we just couldn't laugh at this and go on to the next step. Yesterday I put out an article dealing with campaign finance reform. And Daniel alluded to, what's coming in the next campaign, in the next Congress. And that is what I'm concerned about, because most of it was an attack on the First Amendment. We already have a problem with that, with social media and cracking down on conservative viewpoints and the use of the IRS and different things like that. So I think they're going to work very, very hard to make sure our message isn't heard. So that's why we're going to work harder than ever to make sure that we can get the information out that is vital. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.